Everyone, I'm Kirsty Needham, the Australia and Pacific Politics Correspondent at Reuters. Welcome to CEDA's Economic and Political Overview 2021, where we'll be talking about Australia's place in the world. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we're on Aboriginal land, committed to recognition and reconciliation. We respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Griffith Business School for their support for today's event. Today, as at all CEDA events, you'll be able to interact with speakers through the Q&A portal, which is available via the video link below your screen. Post your own questions, vote on the questions from others, and vote on today's poll question, which is, what do you think should be a focus for Australian policymakers in 2021? The results of the poll will be shared at the end of the session. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is EPO2021, and tagging CEDA News. And now I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those joining us online, and also to welcome those leading this important discussion today on our virtual panel. We have Richard Yetsenga, Chief Economist with the ANZ Banking Group, Professor Jane Golley, Director of the Australian Centre of China in the World at ANU, Mukund Narayanamurti, Chief Executive Officer of Asialink Business, and Professor Byrne, Director of the Griffith Asia Institute. Viewers, you can put forward your own questions for the panel at any time, and we'll endeavour to answer as many as we can in the allotted time at the end. But first, I'm going to ask some questions. And Richard, first question to you. What does global recovery look like this year as vaccines are rolled out? You wrote in your CEDA essay that this is a health and economic crisis, not a financial one, and it will likely be different to the GFC. Can you explain to us why?
I think the recovery is strong. I mean, there are obviously risks out there, there always are, but I think the issue with this crisis is the policy response has been so front-footed that the risks really have to be so substantial to derail what's going on. And in the context of the last 3 months, since mid-November, since we've started to receive this fabulous news on vaccines, I think the vaccines have really been a game-changing event for two reasons. One is they get us to herd immunity. There's a time question, but they get us there. And what that means is policymakers now, I think, have a time frame on which to assess the need for stimulus. And it also, for the first time, this pandemic gives business the ability to plan. Let's not forget as well, if you were going to choose a hemisphere in which to do business, it would be this hemisphere. Asia's more than a third of the global economy. Asia effectively is already back above pre-pandemic levels of activity. That mixed together, to me, looks quite positive. As I say, things could go wrong, but I think policy will be responsive. And that policy lever, I think, is the key difference with the financial crisis. In the financial crisis, we were slow. There were issues in banks and mortgages, and we had to think about what that meant. And then money markets started to seize up, and then the data collapsed, and then policymakers started to respond, and they had to respond with tools which were then kind of experimental and new. This time, I think you could almost see in policymakers as the penny finally dropped, which in many economies was through March, that this was going to be the biggest thing in their lifetimes. It was almost like what happened during the GFC, let's just roll those things out. If Europe did it back then, we probably need to do it now. And so there wasn't a wait for the economic data. There wasn't an analysis of what the problem was. There was just a recognition and then action. And what that means is we just don't have the scarring. The US unemployment rate is 3/4 of the way back to pre-COVID levels. China is already back at pre-COVID levels in terms of measured unemployment. In Australia, unemployment has been falling like a stone. It was the deepest downturn in 100 years last year, but this is the quickest recovery we've ever seen.
Okay, Caitlin, we heard earlier this morning from Australia's ambassador to the United States, Arthur Sinodinos. If the Biden administration seeks to work more with allies in its strategic competition with China, what does that mean for Australia? There are multiple areas of US-China, not just trade, but the race for technology dominance. And last year we had the meeting of the Quad of the US, Japan, India and Australia, and they were talking about the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific and even infrastructure spending in the Pacifics. So how does Australia manage these two big relationships with China and the United States?
Thanks, Kirsty. to be here with you and with this fantastic panel. And can I also just acknowledge traditional owners of the land I'm on here in Brisbane, the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. But to get to your question, I think there are a couple of parts to this, and it's worth thinking about the really key issues facing the Biden administration at the moment. Yes, there has been a clear signal made to allies that they are going to play a really key role in the Biden administration's foreign policy going forward. But there's more to it. And I think we're going to see a couple of key strategies. They won't necessarily be sequential. They're going to be overlocking. First is the way that the Biden administration responds to domestic issues. And in doing so, I'm thinking here in terms of the health, social and economic pressures that they are facing in the US, really significant pressures. The way that that response is delivered is going to be critical to restoring the legitimacy of US leadership, to restoring their reputation globally and in our region. Secondly, I think they're going to be grappling with the nature of US leadership on the global stage. And, you know, over the past 4 years, we've seen a real decline in the kind of role that the US would be playing. So you heard Australia's ambassador to the US this morning talking about the fact that on first day on the job, Biden had re-signed up to the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement. So we are seeing a renewed commitment to multilateralism. That's important for Australia and Australia's commitment to multilateralism as well into the future. I think also we've heard Kurt Campbell, Biden's key advisor on Indo-Pacific strategy, talking about how the US needs to think about the way it restores balance and legitimacy to the Asian region. Balance in terms of shifting power dynamics, legitimacy in terms of the rule of law, the institutional frameworks that we all kind of work through as we navigate the various policy issues. The third big issue is China. There's no question about that. And I don't think it's, whilst, you know, there are clear signs of compatibility of Biden's policy approach to China in relation to the previous administrations, there are going to be some distinct differences. And already we've heard the commentary from the US in terms of we've got to be better at balancing issues of competition with issues of cooperation. There is an absolutely clear role for US-China cooperation on big issues. We need to think about how that influences our own policy as well. And then lastly, in terms of allies, you know, already Secretary of State Blinken has been talking with key allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, Mexico. I think rebuilding the relationship with allies is going to be important, but I think equally for us, Australia, thinking about its engagement in the region, we need to think about those relationships ourselves. We need to know and be very clear in articulating our interests. Our interests with China are going to be different to America's interests. Our interests in terms of the way we engage with the quadrilateral security dialogue, you know, that is an important mechanism for bringing strategic heft to the role we might want to play in our region. We have to think carefully about how we navigate those relationships and make sure they're relationships that we have on our terms. They're not dictated necessarily by others. So I think there are, if I was to sum up, what does this really mean in terms of on-the-ground action for Australia? We've got a more predictable ally in the US. That's a positive, but a more proactive ally, particularly on key issues of health and climate change. We need to be thinking about our policy response there, particularly because we've been lagging. But we also need to think about our diplomacy and our diplomatic presence. Now, that's been declining over decades. It is more important today than ever. And we need to think about it not just in official terms, but in a much more creative way and calibrate that across multiple policy domains. Sorry, big answer to a big question. We can come back.
It's a very, very big question. Look, Jane, talking about China, what can we expect from the Chinese economy this year? And what does that mean for Australia, given the strained diplomatic relationship?
So two very big questions. Thanks, Kirsty, and thanks to CEDA for having me today. To think, first of all, about the Chinese economy, I think the first big point that I'd make is that its growth performance last year was the best in the world. They achieved a target that they projected to achieve from the beginning of the year. The IMF consistently upgraded its forecast. I think they were as low as 1.1% in February last year, and by the end of it, they'd come up to 2%, and officially, they recorded 2.3%. We can't always completely trust the Chinese numbers, but they certainly outperformed and, in fact, recorded the only positive growth of any major economy in the world. Now, that slightly slower growth of 2.3% last year means that this year the growth forecast is up at 8%. They're not the only ones. As Richard said, the global recovery is looking strong. India is also projected to grow by 7.9%. I see this year, although that's on the back of a nearly 10% contraction last year. And so the first point I'd make there is, in sum, that the Chinese economy will be the major contributor to global growth next year, this year, and in the years ahead. That'll slow down as it has been for a long time now, but they'll continue to outperform just about any other economy in the world. We'll see the 14th five-year plan released in March. There's been plenty of talk about that already towards the end of last year. A couple of key points that will continue, I think, to dominate the way that that's framed. One is dual circulation, a strategy that some have likened to American discussions of decoupling, and not just in America, but in the rest of the Western world. I don't see it quite in those terms, but dual circulation essentially is putting a renewed focus on domestic demand, really talking up a long-term push for technological self-sufficiency. That's an ambition that they've laid out plans for through till 2035 and beyond. Also more self-reliance, I think, in a range of sectors, and that will have implications for Australia. For example, in the wake of the pandemic, not only with medical supplies and the like, but also across the agricultural sectors, where we've seen, for example, in barley, that the Chinese are trying to boost their own domestic production there. That's not closing them off to the rest of the world. The other part of the dual circles, the second circulation, is to continue their international trade and investment connections, but that will become increasingly politicised. And we've seen that last year, Australia being a prime example and a prime target, but the Belt and Road countries will trade more with China. Their investment will flow more to Belt and Road countries. We've seen that playing out with vaccine diplomacy, as they call it, but with the pattern of China's distribution of face masks, for example, and now vaccines as well, to countries, for example, that recognise China over Taiwan. What does that all mean for Australia? Troubled times ahead, I think, would be the short version of it. We thought things were tough at the beginning of the year, and last year I wrote a piece for CEDA and described our dependency on China as a blessing in disguise. I could be told I was pretty wrong about that. It was certainly a pretty ugly disguise by year end. I won't reel off the sectors that have been now targeted by China, not all of them connected to the COVID inquiry, and they didn't begin with that. The political relationship and the troubles underpinning it, I think, date back at least 5 years, if not longer. I do make the point that it takes two to tango. The Chinese government are doing a whole range of things, both internally and abroad, that are a cause of deep concern. But the Australian government has also, I think, chosen to go out pretty hard in return. There's a stubbornness on both sides at this point. While there's been a slight softening of rhetoric, I think, from the Prime Minister and the Trade Minister in the start of this year, there is still an insistence, I think, that all of this is China's fault. China's saying it's the ball's in our court, and it's not clear how that political relationship is going to be resolved. Now, then the next big question is, for how long and in what ways will different sectors of the Australian economy be impacted by that deteriorating political relationship? And they've maintained, an extraordinary degree of resilience, really, in aggregate. China still accounted, in fact, for a record 40% of our exports last year, despite the troubles. But that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of sectors and a lot of firms, and then also by implication, a lot of Australian people who are reeling from the impacts of the current restrictions, and very difficult to know just how much more serious they could get if we can't do something to improve that political relationship as well.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question whether or not business can continue to engage with the Chinese market to the same extent if the diplomatic relationship has fundamentally changed. I don't think we're there yet. It certainly seems to be at an impasse at the moment, but I guess the next 12 months will tell whether that diplomatic relationship can be repaired. But Jane, perhaps you can explain to our audience, what is it about? I mean, how important is government endorsement or involvement to doing business in China? Certainly in the past that was the case. Is it still the case?
Well, I'll definitely want to hear what the other panellists have to say as well, because I'm an academic and not a business person. But my research on the topic has looked at the connection between political relations and trade over the last 20 years, going from 1998 to 2018, and across virtually all sectors of about the 35 sectors of the economy that we analysed throughout most of that period in aggregate. It didn't matter if there were little shocks to the political relationship, and there have been plenty of those, from Australia's support of the Hague ruling, all the way through to the COVID inquiry and beyond, the Huawei decision and so on. There's been this remarkable resilience. The trade figures just seem to hold up. And yet if you actually look again at those historical trends, in fact, that political relationship started to have an impact on our mineral exports to China, according to our calculations anyway, back as early as 2013. And if you again understand the history behind that, there were troubles brewing going back as far as the Rio Tinto and the failed Chinalco bid in 2009. That was deeply upsetting to the Chinese government. I'm not saying therefore it shouldn't have happened, but these things do have an impact. And again, that coal or the iron ore, the resource markets, I think, are a good place to look to understand that. We hear people saying, oh, well, China won't punish us in that market because they're so reliant on it. But given their capacity for long-term planning, they are absolutely trying to diversify away from us. They're investing vast sums in Africa, in Brazil, and in Papua New Guinea, for example, in that market. And so the long-term trend, I think, will see our resource sector suffer. Now, that's the sector that kept us buoyant in export terms last year. If you look at services, tourism, education, massive hits, 17,000 jobs lost in education. There's a sector where, without a change of course, I think, from the Australian government, the sector will shrink. And that's, again, complicated by the fact that I will recognise we have become too dependent on a single market, China, in the university sector. Our universities can't cope with that sort of excess dependency. Transitioning away from it and finding new markets, looking to India, looking to Indonesia, great in theory, but those markets are absolutely minuscule. And I think the alternative to that is a shrunken university sector. And that means a lot of people out of jobs.
Yeah, look, that I guess the education sector, but also tourism, are both very reliant on China. I wonder, though, whether some of that's due to the diplomatic relationship, but also simply borders being closed with COVID, and whether we'll see a natural pickup there. Caitlin, you work in the sector. Do you have any thoughts on this?
On the international education piece? Yeah, absolutely. Look, I've written in the past about the fact that in Australia has tended to really commercialise its international education sector, where we have to be so careful. These are important relationships, enduring relationships, that in many cases Australia has been really successful at building and maintaining over time. And I think our connection with international students is something that we really can't take for granted. But I do wonder if we've simply over commercialised the issue and become then very reliant on international students and and insufficiently diversified our intake across the board. And we're hurting as a result of that now. International education, though, takes many forms, and we've got to think about the future, the opportunities for transnational education, for offshore engagement. So I think for online engagement, although that's not certainly never replaces a face-to-face approach, but I think there are all sorts of opportunities, and the key will be here for the Australian university sector to work fairly cohesively together. That's a real challenge in promoting Australian education abroad. In terms of tourism, of course, we're also seeing, Queensland, for example, where I am, has really suffered through the impact of COVID-19 and the closure of borders. We are seeing some repurposing and revisioning of the tourism sector. And I think, certainly where I am, we're doing some work with Pacific Island countries around what that also looks like. How can we learn from each other? How can we actually think forward to potentially when we may have bubbles opening up, will there be some opportunities to engage more closely there, to work together? But certainly learning from each other is going to be absolutely critical, and learning from different experiences across our region.
Okay, look, you mentioned the potential for bubbles, and Richard, I'll quickly ask you this question. There's been lots of talk of trans-Pacific bubbles, Asia bubbles. I guess it depends on which countries and economies recover most quickly when those vaccines roll out. How does that impact on the Australian economy? Are the countries that we naturally trade with the countries that are likely to be engaging in these bubble or travel arrangements?
Look, probably, but I think the shifting around bubbles has changed. Certainly in my mind it has. I think through the middle part of last year, a lot of focus on this issue that it was a bit of a ray of light. But of course, Australia's had the biggest issues with transmission of COVID related to people coming in and out of Australia. So the question, I think, from an economic perspective is, do you want to put the hard-won gains in the rest of the economy at risk to open up part of your tourism sector even in a controlled way? And it seems like there's some more risk aversion around that question. So bubbles are possible, and in the absence of them, or growth would be stronger if we could develop some meaningful bubbles. But policy's also done a good job of offsetting the negative drag. So it's not the thing I kind of think a lot about domestically. The main issue is, I think, when do you think borders will open? And that doesn't look likely. Well, it doesn't look particularly likely this calendar year.
Look, I'd like to remind our online viewers again, you can submit your questions to the panellists by logging on to the panel below the video by logging into Pigeonhole. It's just come up on the screen now. And Mukund, my question to you, how is the business-to-business relationship with China holding up? And if there is a need to find more customers in India and Southeast Asia elsewhere, what should businesses be doing to prepare for this?
Thanks, Kirsty. Really good questions. I'm going to pick up on Jane's points here and highlight that absolutely, despite the many challenges that are reported in the diplomatic relationship with China, we do have record trade surpluses with China this year, and actually over the last 12 months quite consistently. So now we know that that's largely because of the iron ore price, the demand, and also the very healthy forecast for that particular commodity. But at its core, I think that inherent in our strategy, not just with China, but in global markets, has to be to trade in things that are either non-substitutable or are so highly value-added that we have some competitive advantage. And at this point in time, we have a competitive advantage when it comes to iron ore. And I think the points that Jane made actually should be advised in terms of our national industry strategy so that we don't remain static while African and South American mines are actually being developed in competition with Australian mines and projects. This year, we've also benefited, I should say, from an Australian perspective with what's played out in Brazil. So we've been seen as a more dependable supplier. So it's not a static game. It's not so much just a case of others doing things while we remain static. I think that we have been able to do things over a period of time with the development of our projects, with the stability in financing, with the stability in our shipping lanes to ensure that we're a reliable partner. I think there are perhaps three key things for me when I think about the business relationships with China. The first is that there's been a lot of calls over the last 12 months for the business community to actually come out and speak about the relationship with China. And I'd actually go against that and say that the best way for our business community to engage with China is through narrowcast and not through broadcast. From our own engagement with many of the large companies in Australia that have a presence in China, mining companies, energy companies, healthcare companies, infrastructure companies, many of them continue to flourish and continue to be deeply committed to that market because they've been incredibly thoughtful and considered with their engagement. I think the second thing for the business relationship to flourish is that diplomatic relationships, like business relationships, go through cycles. And the best way to have your pulse on the impact that that could have on your business is to actually shore up your external affairs or your government relations team. And again, our research has highlighted that Australian companies, their offshore government relations teams are typically smaller in size and more poorly resourced compared to their US, European, and Japanese counterparts. So that's a very practical thing that our companies can do to ensure that they have the pulse on policy and regulatory changes that could potentially come their way and harm their business. And then finally, just building on a point that I made earlier, and without being naive here about our importance and self-importance, I think that those businesses and those sectors that more closely align themselves with China's national development priorities around urbanization, infrastructure development, healthcare, aged care, are more likely to withstand the challenges of the current environment. With countries which have had relationships with China, which have been heavily focused in sectors with discretionary choices, the automotive sector, consumer electronics, fast-moving consumer goods, and of course, we also have exposure in our country through those sectors to China, it will likely be a bumpier road ahead. Now, your point on India and Southeast Asia is a really relevant one because market diversification is, of course, top of mind at the moment for everyone. But the first thing with India and Southeast Asia as regions is that neither of them will be the next China. And I agree with Jane's points there. And neither of them will be the next China, not necessarily only because of the size and the scale, but fundamentally because the nature of the opportunities are different. So if there were to be shocks tomorrow in the iron ore sector, India is not going to be a market of $100 billion worth of iron ore because India is actually a net exporter of iron ore. So the capacity and the willingness of customers in India and Southeast Asia to pay for the things that China has valued in buying from us is going to be fundamentally different. So that leads to my second point, which is that we really need to look at India and Southeast Asia as regions that bring their own value proposition to engagement with Australia. So we need to be clear about the opportunities with those markets. So with Southeast Asia, with their incredibly progressive digital economy, we should be thinking about opportunities with that region in digital health, in fintech, in edtech, in real estate technologies as examples. With India, we should be looking at opportunities in broader financial services, in healthcare, in fast-moving consumer goods. But really, one of the key things here as we think about these markets is that we need a fundamentally different set of capabilities to do business with these markets. And one of the core things here is that we have to be willing to invest and have a presence on the ground in India, in Indonesia, and these other markets. We can't trade with them like we've traded with China. We trade a lot with China, but we're not really in China. If you look at where our investment goes, it doesn't necessarily go to China. And so a lot of that bulk commodity trade that we have been accustomed to with China in particular and a few other markets in Northeast Asia will not necessarily be the same proposition for us with customers in India and Southeast Asia.
Look, I might open that great topic of diversification up to the rest of the panel. Obviously, iron ore suppliers are doing well, sales are booming, Australia's in a unique position there, but there's a whole list of other categories, particularly in agriculture and wine, that have been hit by what I guess is called non-tariff barriers in the last 6 months. And we've heard our trade ministers and other ministers in the Morrison government talk to Australian businesses and exporters about diversifying. They say they're out there trying to strike new free trade agreements. They're working with the UK post-Brexit on whether there's another market there. India, although, that's a very difficult proposition, I think, to get to get a free trade agreement, but greater access to India. Indonesia, there was a free trade agreement inked there recently, and there's been more dialogue with Japan. But how realistic is trade diversification for Australia, and how long does it take? I might go round the panel. Jane, did you want to say something on that first, and then we'll see what everyone else has to say?
Yeah, sure. Look, I'll start with an anecdote and then link back to the really big question of US-China relations. And the anecdotes too that I've heard in the wine, and focusing on the wine industry, a local wine grower here in Canberra has sold all of his distribution channels in China and is moving out of the market and doing pretty well, establishing new sales and strengthening sales in Vietnam, for example. Another wine grower that I know personally just recently sold their vineyard and at a very good price to another Australian, but they never had markets. They weren't really distributing in China in the first place. So I think it's a good indication, just those two stories, of how different companies within a given sector will be hit differently depending on what they were doing in the past. But it links back to your opening question, Kirsty, about the importance of alliances and how the US deals with China and then how that impacts on Australia in the future. And I think a good example of that, again, with the wine sector was last year when the tariffs came onto Australia, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China or against China, that's spanning now, I think, some 15 or 20 democratic countries across the world, put out a video and it was translated into Chinese, where basically every country had a spokesperson saying, for example, that they liked Japanese sake the best, or that French Sauvignon Blanc was the tastiest, and so on. I thought it was a Chinese advertisement saying, please buy Japanese sake, but it turned out to be this advertisement, as many of you would have seen, saying, we're going to stand by our Australian friends and buy Australian wine. And yet that comes to the crux really of a key distinction between China and the rest of us, and that is that the Australian government or the American government, they can suggest that an American consumer buys more Australian wine, but they certainly can't control it. The Chinese government has more power. They have a stronger connection to their own companies to insist on who they might purchase from. And so that means really that I think that kind of alliance building and the hope that the French are somehow going to switch from champagne to Yance, I think that's wishful thinking, and we're going to need to do a lot more careful thinking about how to develop those markets that don't rely on allies who simply aren't going to come to the rescue, I don't think, just because they're our friends.
Yes, certainly those supermarket and bottle shop shelves in Beijing and Shanghai are crowded with foreign product, and there's a lot of international exporters wanting to get into that Chinese consumer market, as there always has been, just the weight of numbers and the size of that rising middle class there. Caitlin, diversification, is that the only option for Australian exporters? We've become so reliant on the China market, and how easy is that to do?
Yeah, I think diversification is a really important conversation for us to be having. But I would go back to what both Jane and Mukund have said. There's really no future for Australia in which China does not play a significant role, and that includes in our trading profile. So I think it's important to really be thinking broadly in perspective about that. And that's the same for most countries, many countries around the world, including those countries in our region. But I think we do have to be thinking very carefully, not just about the diversification of markets, and we should be engaging much more intensely with Indonesia and India, as well as with the key emerging markets in Southeast Asia, where we really don't have a great presence. And I think this is a reflection on the fact that Australian businesses broadly are not deeply engaged in our Asian region. And we've got a lot of capability building to do there in order to develop that capacity, the skills, the networks that are needed on the ground, but also in the boardrooms in terms of realising the diversification dream. But I think also we've got to think about our sectors, and, far and away, our export market is dominated by commodities. International education leads in terms of service sector exports, but it's a long way behind those big commodity markets. So we need to be thinking in a much more sophisticated way about the kinds of markets we're engaged in, our innovation agenda and how we can add value. And we also need to think not just in terms of bilateral FTAs. You mentioned the FTA with Indonesia, hugely important, and it's a great reflection of a relationship that's developing. But broadly, there is an economic integration agenda underway. Arthur Sinodinos pointed to RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that is a trade engagement platform for ASEAN and its free trade partners. That includes Australia, it includes China, as well as the TPP. Now, these are important agendas that offer new opportunities in terms of the way we think about complex supply chains. And we need to have the sophistication to understand how we engage with these broader markets within our foreign policy capacity as well. And just a point, Mukund has spoken about this. I've mentioned our Asia capability. There is a temptation at the moment, while borders are closed, for us to think, we don't need to build our skills in Asia capability. We don't need to worry about language capabilities, for example. I would argue we need to be worried about that more than ever. We need to be investing in language, in broader technology skills, and in innovation skills, so that the next generation of young Australians are going to be able to navigate what is going to be a much more complex landscape for them.
Richard, diversification, is that the future for Australian exporters, and how important is that to the economy?
Well, look, diversification, I think, is additive. It can't replace trade with China. You can't, if you want to talk about diversifying away from the world's largest trading nation, you may as well talk about diversifying away from the US dollar as a source of financing. It's not realistic. But Mukund made an interesting point, I thought, a really practical point about government relations teams. I think the wrap-up of all of this is politics matters, whether you're operating domestically and wherever you're operating domestically, and certainly if you're operating trading relationships. Everyone might date it differently, but I think the Brexit vote in 2016 showed that even in advanced economies where politics historically hasn't really been a huge business issue, politics all of a sudden matters, and matters in a really big way. And there's a shift in policy which kind of, I guess, reinforces that. We've come out of a 30 or 40-year period where monetary policy has had policy primacy, and now we're very clearly in a fiscal era. Fiscal policy has no blunt tool. There is no interest rate or budget you can move independent of everything else. The budget outcome is just a reflection of, who you choose to tax, where you choose to spend, who you choose to give some support to. So politics matters much more than it used to, regardless of where you are.
We've got some questions. Oh, yes, sure.
I was just going to add to that, not just politics and obviously not domestic only, but global politics, also policy, which can be quite distinct from the politics behind it, becomes so important. And an example I'd give is, the shift that we know we'll see and have already seen with Biden compared with Trump with regard to environmental policy, signing up to the Paris Agreement. You couple that with China's now decade-long goal at least, and it again projects out through to 2035, their plans for greening the economy. That necessarily, I think, means that, our resource demand or supplies are not going to find the markets that they did in the future. And so taking that into account as part of your expansion or diversification, your longer-term strategic planning becomes far more important than I think has been given the weighting it deserves, in the past.
Kirsty, can I just add a point on this discussion? I think, just building on Richard's point, I think it's incredibly important for this conversation on market diversification to really be framed as a China plus strategy for all the reasons that Richard highlighted. And one of the key reasons for that is because businesses across sectors have invested significant time and effort to build their business operations in and with the Chinese market. And to think that we can diversify away from China to India or to Indonesia because they are completely different and far more reliable, and that there will not be similar risks, I think is not, in my opinion, the best approach. Because certainly what my takeaway is that with many of our partners in the region, they do not decouple foreign policy, strategic, and economic interests. And we've seen that repeatedly in the past with India as well, when they have had concerns about our position on various foreign policy issues. they bring that up in trade-related discussions. We've had that with Indonesia as well. And what I would hate for us to do is to create a market diversification strategy away from China. And in 5 years' time, we're having a conversation on an India plus and then an Indonesia plus strategy. I think this all has to be part of the portfolio of opportunities that we very skillfully navigate, recognizing that our counterparts look at international partnerships and negotiation very differently to us. And therefore, we need to take stock of all of the positions that we put forward across foreign policy, strategic and economic issues to protect and build our relationships.
It really is about an integrated policy approach to the kind of regional landscape that we face, and being really carefully calibrated about that. I think the diversification conversation shouldn't be about moving away from China at all. It really is that how do we engage on much more multi-dimensional levels with our broad region?
We've got a great question from the audience, looking at what the future, I guess, of globalised trade negotiations and dealings between nations look like. And that is, what does the panel think about the likelihood of reform of the WTO, and how important is that to Australia's future success as an export-reliant nation? Richard, did you want to tackle that one?
I think, unfortunately, we discovered that the dispute resolution arm of the WTO is quite easy to hobble, actually. The WTO is a consensus-based organisation. It reached agreement largely through, I guess, the forceful action of one or two large economies, typically. And in a sense, that consensus process worked in a world where people were effectively playing the same game. I think in an environment where different agendas and different games are being played, I think the structure of the WTO has a problem. I really hope it can be reformed in a way to be more effective. But related to it, I think, is support for free trade as an idea. It seems like the Trump administration found something in the US population, and whether it's been exacerbated or they've created it. But one of the legacies of the Trump presidency seems, even under Biden, that support for free trade is pretty lukewarm. And the US is not alone. The Brexit vote in the UK, I think lots of countries have taken a different view on trade. Making sure we distribute the winnings from globalisation properly, I think, are going to be important to also rebuilding support for free trade within economies, which is the foundation, I think, for getting the right support and reforming the WTO.
It's interesting, isn't it, that WTO reform has been one of those areas of cooperation and dialogue between Australia and China. Jane, did you want to make any comment on WTO reform?
Oh, look, I'll agree with Richard. I think they're very difficult times ahead for the WTO. They just can't seem to reach consensus on anything, and they're being assaulted from all sides. And I would, point the finger at the US most prominently there, where they have just clearly gone against WTO rulings on so many occasions this year, primarily targeted at China. China for a long time has wanted a greater voice in there, sort of consummate with its global economic power status, and it's found that really difficult to push through. They, meanwhile, you hear Xi Jinping regularly talking about upholding free trade principles and being committed to multilateralism on the one hand, whilst using coercive tactics against us and others on the other. So I think there's a lot of duplicity that really plays out within the WTO. And I think the future, I guess I'll say, unfortunately, for economists, we're brought up to believe in multilateralism as the best solution, that it creates the largest pie. And yet what we've seen, not just last year, but a really longer term trend than that, is one towards bilateral free trade agreements. There's spaghetti bowls we think of all over the world of these different agreements being struck. I think we will see more minilateral agreements, like with the Five Eyes Alliance, if they build that up into something that represents some kind of free trade agreement as well. But you can't deny the fact that all of these mini trade agreements run counter to the lovely principle of free trade and the open global trading system that we continue to profess to want to uphold. And so I think we really need to have much more honest conversations about the different ways in which all countries are breaking those rules, and also be frank about the fact that the WTO is, I think, probably doomed, for the longer term.
Here's another question from our online audience. Given China's investment and interest in Papua New Guinea, to what degree can Australia rely on our long-standing goodwill in the Pacific region and soft power and diplomacy to secure our interests? I guess this topic's been in the news a lot recently. Caitlin, did you want to answer that?
Sure. Well, I think we've seen Australia really refocus its policy towards the Pacific since about 2017-18 with the Pacific Step Up. And that has reflected this intense geopolitical contest that is playing out in the Pacific. And, for many, that Pacific Step Up it was a little too little and too late. And I think, we've got a lot of rebuilding of relationships and a lot of sustaining relationships to go. One of the things I think is important in that Pacific Step Up, though, and this comes through quite a bit of the rhetoric, is the fact that Pacific Island nations are sovereign nations who are going to be assessing their own national interest and making decisions based on what is put to them and how they see the world. And unless we are, really genuine and authentic in our policy approaches, I think we tend to be seen as fairly transactional in this space. So I think any decisions made by Pacific Islanders have to be viewed as their decisions. Australian soft power, has been in many ways on the decline. There's certainly increased investment in that. And through COVID-19, our engagement through development assistance will be really critical. But I don't think that we should just rely on goodwill. We have to be genuine partners in the region working together. And we can't necessarily expect Pacific Island nations to make the decisions we want out of goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
Look, Mukund, a question for you from the audience. You were speaking earlier about the need for boots on the ground in international expansion for a business. Someone has asked, in the past, bricks and mortar investments were needed when entering new international markets, but has COVID changed that? Do we need to diversify more into digital solutions? Now, do you think that works, given what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it does have an answer embedded in it. And so my points were specifically in the context of certain sectors which offer opportunities for us with India. And so if you look at the India economic strategy of the Australian government or the Australia economic strategy, which the Indian government has recently released, they both call for greater levels of investment from Australian companies in specific sectors, as an example, to participate in the development of infrastructure in India. Now, in a sector such as infrastructure, whether it's transport infrastructure, telecommunications infrastructure, energy infrastructure, you actually need to have an investment and a presence on the ground. Now, if you're looking at fast-moving consumer goods, I think what COVID has highlighted is that you can absolutely complement or perhaps even replace in certain instances a bricks and mortar traditional distributor relationship with really sophisticated, considered e-commerce strategies. And then you've got a third category of businesses where you've got companies in sectors such as healthcare that offer, for instance, digital solutions that are actually looking to really look at opportunities in the broader digital economy that go beyond just e-commerce solutions to provide services into, for instance, urban and also rural and regional communities in Indonesia and other markets in Southeast Asia, because they've got particular digital health applications. So this ability to offer digital solutions has definitely come to the fore as a result of the last 12 months, but it will not in every circumstance, in the context of every market and every sector, always be the only solution.
And Richard, the last question from our audience to you, and I'll ask you for a quick answer, but it's a very big question. This person says, we've heard for many years about the false economic bubble of China that will eventually burst. Is that still the case? And can Australia plan and prepare for that?
I don't think there's a bubble in China that will burst. I certainly think if the world thought China would copy it, what's turned out to happen, particularly on economic policy, is the world's become closer to copying China's approach to economic policy. Certainly if you compare the policy response to this crisis to China's policy response during the financial crisis. But China does have some structural challenges, there's no doubt. It's got a demographic problem. Its demographic profile looks similar to Japan in the 1980s and 1990s. It's got quite high levels of debt, not compared to other economies necessarily, but certainly compared to other economies at its stage of development. And of course, its number one source of economic growth has been, this great, fantastic trade and export story that's evolved over the last 30 years. And the geopolitical environment seems to suggest that's facing some limits. And certainly you can't keep, as the world's largest trading nation, you just can't keep growing your market share. People will start to try and make their domestic industries more competitive. So I think there'll be slowdown in the rate of growth in China, and I think that's structural. I still don't think China will be larger than the US economy by 2030. I've said before it might not even be there by 2050. I'm a bit less confident about that given the performance of the two economies last year. But I think once again, I suspect people will be starting to revise their estimates of when China will be bigger than the US.
Okay, and we'll just go around the panel now for one final comment from you each. Jane, do you want to start?
Sure. I'll just follow on from Richard's point. I think there's a whole industry out of predicting the collapse of China, and it dates back to at least 2002 when Gordon Chang wrote his book, The Coming Collapse of China. And if you wait long enough, you can always be proven right on these predictions. But Tom Orlick has put out a book, I think just late last year, called The Bubble That Never Burst. And, I think there is a tendency, not among the business community in Australia, but certainly among other strategic thinkers, that somehow the slowdown of the economy is going to be what saves us from, what's otherwise called the China challenge. And I don't see that happening. And of course, economists can always be wrong by projecting or predicting anything. We usually are. There are risks to the Chinese economy. They're well known. There's an aging population. There's a looming debt crisis that can, by definition of a crisis, appear at any time, and it will take us all by surprise when it happens. Productivity growth is constrained. They've got problems in their education sector. They trickle on and relate to the constraints that Xi Jinping is imposing on Chinese people. And that, of course, then spreads and affects private sector development, for example. But I think I can't but end on the point that and I think it's been made really well by the panellists here today, is that there's no escaping China. And whilst diversification might make sense in theory, I think if we start thinking more about expansion, about how to take those economic benefits that we've reaped from China and use those lessons to expand out whilst not trying to leave that super economic power behind, then the Australian economic outlook for the future will be a lot brighter.
And Caitlin, a final quick comment from you.
Sure. And look, just kind of reflecting also on Arthur Sinodinos's speech this morning, I feel very positive now that we have the Biden administration in place. But if nothing else, I think that underscores how important it is for Australia to to intensify its engagement right across the Asia-Pacific region. And I think, we've seen worrying signs about particularly language skills dropping off, student engagement with Asia falling back. I think more than ever, we need a really strong investment from both government and business in the importance of maintaining our Asia engagement capabilities in many forms. And I think that incorporates language, it incorporates understanding the landscape. It's deeply worrying we don't have media representatives in China at the moment. Our journalistic capabilities fit into this landscape as well. So Asia engagement on the ground, in our universities, in our boardrooms, remains a priority. And I'd love to see both business and government sort of playing a leading role there.
Those are all good points. And Mukund, the last word with you.
Thanks, Kirsty. I share the view that regionalism is really the new globalism. It's something that Parakana and others have spoken about, and certainly within Asialink business, it's something that we believe very strongly in, and we do believe in it for a few key reasons. The first is that intra-Asian trade now is greater than trade that Asia has with the rest of the world. That means that increasingly our biggest competitors in the business community will not come from Western companies competing for market share in Asia, but will come from Asian companies. And that therefore leads to my final point, that the time for trying to solve Asia's problems and teaching Asia how to do things and go up the development curve has largely gone. The future will be for us to actually learn from Asia and to actually fulfill our economic and industry strategy in this country.
Okay, and I promised to come back to the poll result. The poll question was, what do you think should be a focus for Australian policymakers in 2021? And 44% of you said growing alternative export markets for goods and services. So that's on the mind of our audience. Now we're close to the end of the time we have here, so I'd like to thank the audience and thank our participants today, Richard, Jane, Caitlin, Mukund, for sharing their insights. And also a big thank you to our live stream sponsor, the Griffith Business School. The poll result and a video of the event will be available on the CEDA website. You can keep up to date on CEDA's program by visiting the website. And I believe the next event will be an ACCC Enforcement and Compliance Policy Update. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.